it really struck a nerve within the farming community because so many of the buildings, they wouldn't be protected. So they're not protected structures, they're not national monuments, but they're kind of protected by the people that owned them. You know, their grandfather roofed them, the uncle that bought the farm in 1935 put up that shed. They're able to tell you those stories. So while it's not kind of official state heritage with interpretation, signage and boards, its heritage is really close to people's hearts.
It's great to be back with another Environment Edge podcast, and you're very welcome to the show. With so many historic buildings scattered throughout the countryside that remind us of farming in the past, how can we ensure these buildings live on?
Anna Meenan, Traditional Farm Buildings Grant Scheme Programme Manager, and Ian Doyle, Head of Conservation with the National Heritage Council in Kilkenny, joins us for a chat.
I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Lynn,
your Teagasc Sustainability Advisors. And we're back for another Environment Edge podcast number 91, and here we go.
Anna and Ian, you're extremely welcome to the show. Now, I have a nice awkward question to start off with. Why do the Department of Ag have a conservation and repair of traditional farm buildings and related structures funded scheme?
I remember when it was being set up and there was all these new agri-environment schemes being talked about and set up, and the Heritage Council was saying, these schemes are brilliant, they're brilliant for wildlife, they're brilliant for water quality. Can we do something on historic farm buildings? And I think the benefit was that it was, if we did it 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 buildings a year, it was something that was really specific and measurable. So you know that acronym SMART, specific, measurable, all that kind of thing. There was something that you could capture every year and report back on. And I think it struck a nerve, and Anna will help me out here. It really struck a nerve within the farming community because so many of the buildings, they wouldn't be protected. So they're not protected structures, they're not national monuments, but they're kind of protected by the people that owned them. You know, their grandfather roofed them, the uncle that bought the farm in 1935 put up that shed. They're able to tell you those stories. So while it's not kind of official state heritage with interpretation, signage and boards, its heritage is really close to people's hearts. And the Department of Agriculture, in fairness to them, picked up on that kind of feedback. And the scheme just went from strength to strength. And then the wildlife element was a really important part of those early agri-environment schemes as well, and the current ones. And a lot of it just goes down to Anna's dedication on it. We embedded that kind of holistic, natural, cultural environment. In other words, it's not just about saving a building, it's about the wildlife, the swifts, the birds, the bats in it as well. And that spoke to the various objectives of those schemes.
They mean something to people.
Yeah.
You know, they really mean something to people. Like you meet so many farmers that, you know, can trace back, you know, kind of 3, 4, 5 generations on their farm. And so they'll know the person maybe in their family who, let's say, carried out those repairs or who built that building. And, you know, yourself, if you go into a lot of farmhouses, the photo that's on that wall, that was probably taken in the 70s from a helicopter of the aerial view of the farmyard. And it still has pride of place in the house. You see so many of those. So I think they really do mean something to people. Mm-hmm.
I can definitely echo that. I remember my training back in the day under the REP scheme and then the AOS scheme and the GLOS schemes. When we walk farms, and myself and Cathal walk farms all the time and build up a relationship with the farmers. As you're walking these old farms, you know, there's so many vernacular features. There's old gates, old styles, there's old bridges, old barns, old dwelling houses. And you're dead right when you say that. They touch on the heartstrings, you know, whether the people have just purchased them, they know the history of them. But if they've been passed down through generations, people want to retain them.
They have a sense of custodianship. You know, it's almost like, you know, that's definitely, I think, fairly ingrained in terms of people. You know, they don't want it falling down on their watch.
Actually, we have a good few buildings around home, old farm buildings as well, and a lot of them were actually built out of field stone. So I spent years childhood picking stones off field, backbreak and stuff, and then you'd be brought up to see, well, actually, look at the houses that were built from those, and then if you go inside, actually, particularly just ones at home, even still, where you look up at the roof, and the craftsmanship and the carpentry is unbelievable what they were able to do at that time. You're probably going to shoot me now because we actually took a grain store and made it part of our house. Now we kept all the old features outside. It's probably not what you're looking for in heritage, but we still have lots of other old buildings that probably could do with some work. But that brings me, I suppose, to the next question. What type of agricultural buildings falls under the scope of the Heritage Council grant?
Buildings that are built of traditional construction. So generally you're looking at generally there'd be stone built, obviously there'd be some in terms of built of mud. And you're looking at, I suppose, kind of pre-1950s. So it would be kind of barns, granaries, dairies, cow houses, but also maybe other buildings that are now in use for the farm. So you'd also be dealing with one time that maybe it was a dwelling, but had been converted into a bar. So that's also now something that's considered. And we can also look at things like the farm field gates, cobbled yards, kind of farm field boundary walls. Also, we've done a couple of farm bridges as well. So all of that's something for consideration, you know.
Sometimes you'd see, you know, in the application, you'd see a building with a fireplace or the remains of some shelving, and you'd know that it was probably a family reared in that before it became a farm building. You know, and sometimes the aerial photograph or the map, you'll see where the house was built on, the modern house that succeeded. And then there's a smaller number of cases, the ones that I get really excited about. My background is archaeology. When you see castles, powerhouses in the farmyard that started off with a castle, and they're used for a store, for animals, putting tools in nowadays. I love to see those schemes coming in, as long as they're in agricultural use.
Actually, you're after jumping two questions in my mind there. First, and I think I'll run to you. And the first one, if you came across a building that was used as a cattle shed for the last, I don't know, 100 years, but you found out that it was originally an actual house for people, a dwelling house. Like, do you look to restore it to the dwelling house or to the cattle house?
We don't look to restore it for a dwelling house on this scheme. Like, one of the things obviously is that the buildings must be retained in agricultural use or put to agricultural use. It doesn't mean that if it's a cattle shed, it has to stay as a cattle shed. They can look at other uses in terms of the farm, just not in terms of habitable uses.
When you think of so many of these buildings, they were built, the late 19th century, the early 20th century, before massive mechanization, when your numbers would have been so much smaller in terms of stockage. Whereas the trend now is you'd have a slatted shed, you'd have a large steel shed structure. So they're not really suitable for that kind of modern agriculture. But what we would see people do is use them to store materials in, chemicals, maybe look after sick or weak animals in. So the farmers, the families, they would always generally find a use for them, keep them within agricultural use.
Some of the work could be very, very specialist as well, like replacing the likes of beams, old heads, sills, joints, the render, pointing of the stone, like using lime plaster. So you'd want a trained tradesperson to do the work. Would you have a list of builders or conservationists or specialists that could work on those buildings? Or could you get training yourself to try and do this work?
40% of the projects have involved farmers carrying out some or all of the repairs themselves. So that can be something in terms of where they've got training, in terms of there's different organisations that hold training courses in the use of lime, which is the big thing in terms of the historic buildings, as well as carpentry repair and things like that. Or sometimes what has worked well is where somebody is engaged, maybe let's say a stonemason, come to their farm and provide them with training for maybe 2 or 3 days, just in terms of, at least in terms of getting them started. So that's all kind of, and we also have sources in terms of on our website, in terms of different, let's say, advice for kind of repairs and case studies and things like that that people can learn from.
But when,
It's fantastic to know.
When each project gets funded, it has to have a conservation advisor. So they'd give a kind of a specification as to what can take place or what kind of works. So you're right, it's things like lime render. It's about trying to retain as much joinery as you can, using as much of the traditional slate, salvaging as much as you can. So you're right about the specialist skills, but I think Anna's point is really important. When the scheme was set up, it was done on the basis that there are traditional craft skills that we want to retain, we want to try keep in use. So that kind of tradition joinery, repairing, lime mortar, lime plaster, things like that that make these buildings distinctive. And what was really, really important for us only 2 weeks ago, Anna and our chief executive was at an award ceremony in Bucharest, because the scheme was entered into I'd like to get the title right, the European Heritage Prize, Europa Nostra Awards for Heritage. And it won in the education and training category. And then when we went to Bucharest, it won one of 5 Grand Prix winners. So these are like the heritage equivalents of the Oscars. So it was great to have the scheme recognised like that. But the reason I mention it is because it was in the education and training category, because the jurors across Europe saw that the passing on of those skills was just so important. And that's part of the DNA of the scheme.
It's fantastic.
We have to have the passing on of those skills, because we don't build like that anymore. You know, they're load-bearing masonry. We don't build like that anymore. So we need the people there that are able to repair them. So it's so good that there's traditional skills people engaged on the scheme, but also there's that upskilling as well in terms of farmers, because generally they don't just have that one building; they'll have a number of buildings in terms of their farm. So it's kind of what you might call future proofing.
And trying to hold on to those skills, I assume it's going to be harder and harder, especially if there's big bills that are easier to complete rather than the old crafts. But I think there's still plenty of people, craftsmen around that like to hold the old traditional skills.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a wow factor when you're walking around a farm and you see a nice old building. We've won the yard with the 1913 is a plaque on the wall for it.
And I think when you see a building and the roof is in great condition, when the joinery is good, when it's, the rainwater is running off the right way, you get a lift out of it as well. It lifts the whole farmyard.
When is the scheme opening again, and who can apply for it?
We expect the scheme to open in early enough in the new year, so in 2025. That will be subject to Department of Agriculture funding, which we fully expect will be happening. And who can apply? Well, those farmers who are participating in agri-environment schemes, such as acres, such as organics, and such as a number of the EIPs. So, and that has been the criteria for this year. I don't expect that to change in terms of, let's say, in 2025.
There's kind of a short window as well there as well. And I suppose if somebody was thinking about applying, they'd want to be getting their ducks in a row, really, with getting the pictures, organising their conservationist, archaeologist or whoever they have in place to have a look at it, and looking at the previous applications to see how much information is required, because it's there's a lot of information required, isn't there? To get it across the line.
That first step, Deirdre, when they apply, all they need to do is provide particular photographs, a cost estimate, a map, and answer the questions on the form. So that's all they need to do, is what you might call that first step by the application deadline. And then it's only if it's shortlisted would they have to start engaging in terms of a conservationist and getting a bat and bird survey done. The first step is just photographs, a map, answer the questions on the form, and provide a cost estimate.
The idea is that we'd hate the idea of people incurring cost at that early stage.
Yeah.
So once you're shortlisted, then it's worth your while to engage a conservation professional who will advise you on it.
Would somebody who's living, so say if the vernacular feature or the building that's going to be, you want to have restored, is near, say, a public road that can be seen versus somewhere that's very remote, would that have a loading or a bearing on whether you get the funding or not?
There's a question in terms of what will be the public benefit of your project. But public benefit is not just a building which is on the public road. We have somebody today who's hosting in Cork, who's hosting, an acres visit to their farm in terms of their farm building project. We have somebody tomorrow in Offaly who's hosting a big gang of agricultural students in terms of their building. I'm going to be showing them in terms of the repairs they're carried out. That's an excellent public benefit. That building can't be seen from the public road. So it's looking overall in terms of what would be the public benefit. And we give ideas on that in terms of the application.
Are you ever concerned, and you kind of mentioned there, on the different schemes that you have to be in to be able to apply? Is there ever people that miss out that maybe don't have a herd number that can't be in the schemes, that there's buildings that you're looking at saying, geez, that'd be lovely if that was sorted out? It's a bit of heritage is falling down in front of us.
There's a lot of people interested in the scheme.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of people who don't have a herd number, or maybe who aren't in those particular farming schemes, who are very interested in the scheme.
So we'd always be looking at ways to try expand that. So, there's a whole swathe of farmers across the country, bigger farmers, I suppose, for want of a better term, who aren't in any of those agri-environment schemes and who have amazing farm complexes. So we're always open to suggestions as to how we could do that. Now, the scheme was reviewed 2-3 years ago, and it did highlight that point. And maybe in a subsequent iteration of it, it might be possible to do something.
It just struck me when you were talking about your architecture and the castles. And on my way to work every day, there's a castle in the middle of a farmyard, and it's just fallen. It's fallen down. It's like a tower of a castle. It's lovely. And then I see a lot of the old mills, and they're massive. They're the big mills with the wheel, the whole lot there. And if they don't get looked after, they'll be gone as well. But that's where it's kind of brought me with that question. But you kind of, currently that's not available, so I suppose we'll stick with what is available. But you kind of started off there with telling us kind of what the process was with the application. What happens after that?
Well, so let's say after the deadline, then the applications are reviewed. They're reviewed by us internally, but we also have a panel. We gather grant assessment panel in terms of assessing the applications. And what they'll be looking at is they'll be looking at the information that people have supplied in terms of the answers to the questions, and also the photographs and the map. And they're assessing them in terms of the architectural heritage value, in terms of the biodiversity, in terms of environmental sustainability, in terms of the public benefit and the landscape setting. And they're also scored in terms of those different criteria. And then it's just a question of looking at the funding that's available, the score that an application has achieved. And it's almost like marking, and it's a difficult thing to do, but you try and let's see how far the funding can go in terms of those projects from what you might call the top score down. So,
is there? We mentioned environment a bit there as well. Do you have to do with some sort of? I think you mentioned bats and maybe owls and stuff. Is there an environmental impact assessment or anything involved in it, or some sort of survey?
If it's shortlisted, most of our projects will have to engage an ecologist in terms of carrying out a bat and bird survey. Okay. But also this year, for the first year, have also a number of projects which are engaging botanists in terms of, let's say, so it's flora and fauna that we're interested in. So, and the fees for that are included in any kind of grant that are offered. Like most of the buildings that we support, and most buildings, you have to think of them, is that they're wildlife habitats. And, we're the Heritage Council, and all heritage matters to us. So we're coming back with a lot of good data in terms of the various bats and birds that have been found in the buildings, which just adds kind of value to them,
Yeah, and I think, what was it, last year, the year before, we got somebody to actually pull together all the bat habitat surveys and lodge them with the National Biodiversity Data Centre.
Yeah.
So it was adding to that knowledge.
Yeah.
So the scheme counts in that way too.
So what works are funded, and how many people would qualify each year? And then a step on again, 3 questions in one. How much money is available? And can you apply more than once? We'll start off with what works are funded.
Money.
That's what it boils down to at the end of the day, really.
We say the repairs are to the external envelope. So generally repairs to roof, repairs to walls, repairs to external joinery. Now, we can cover internal works where it would be necessary for the structural stability of the structure. So that's where you see kind of a lot of loft floors kind of being repaired under a building. Also maybe the drainage around the building. How is that working? anything that will help with what you might call the survival of the building can be looked at. So that's the kind of works that can be supported. In terms of the grants available, grants can range from between 4,000 up to 30,000 euro, and it's up to 75% of the grants. So there must be a 25%, let's say, input from the farmer in terms of the costs that are available. And the grant is towards the materials, the labour, the fees, anything, in terms of that's eligible in terms of going towards the project.
And it would fund maybe up to 80 to 90 projects per year?
No, not quite. But maybe 70 to 80.
Yeah, about 70 to 80.
So once the building then has been, say, renovated, or is there a possibility for that structure in the future to become housing or domestic, or does it have to remain as such for a certain period?
It must remain in agricultural use for at least 5 years following payments of the grant. And like we inspect buildings under the scheme, and also the Department of Agriculture inspect buildings under the scheme. But also, to be honest, I think most farmers want to, they do it because they want to keep the buildings for the farm. And most of the works that we do, they wouldn't particularly facilitate in terms of any other use apart from the farm either.
Sorry, just wondering, when we're talking about buildings, which what's the story of planning permission with those buildings? Do you adhere to the same rules, or is there some exemptions?
Well, they're existing buildings and we're carrying out repairs on them. So planning permission being, let's say, a consideration on the scheme. There's some buildings that are protected. We have a couple this year in terms of the National Monuments Act, and also a couple that are protected structures. So in that way, we're dealing with the National Monument Service and also kind of the local authorities. But again, it's just in terms of consents and, agreeing the kind of works that will be permitted. So, but otherwise, no.
And that's what the conservation consultant would advise upon. That's their bread and butter. That's the kind of thing they know all about. So it makes it work easily.
Does it take long then to get approved once the application has gone in and you've sanctioned them to go ahead?
It takes a bit of time because it kind of depends also how many applications you might receive by the deadline. So it does take a little bit of time. But we also tell people, we give people an idea about when they'll get a decision. Like last year, let's say this year when we opened, we told people that they would have a decision by May. And that did happen in terms of the outcome of their application, whether that's a no or a yes. So it takes time, and also it's, as long as, it's a conservation ethos, generally, that if it's not a conservation ethos, it can take longer in terms of agreeing approach in terms of works. That's the only thing.
If anybody wants any further information on when the scheme is opening and the particulars around the application process, where would they find them?
They'll find them on our website at www.heritagecouncil.ie. And just to say that we hope to open the 2025 scheme in January. So do keep an eye on the website, probably from, let's say, next month on.
I think what you're doing is a really interesting topic we're talking about today, and I love the whole idea behind why it was done. Sometimes when we look at these things, we look at the money we can get and putting it into our buildings to keep them up. But I think definitely farmers and non-farmers around the country really appreciate when you go into yards or you're driving by a yard and you see especially an unusual type building of an old style building. They're really unbelievable to look at, and they're always a focal point in every farm area they go to see, and the farmers always notice them. So I think you're doing really, really good work, and I'm hoping that you can extend it even more into the future. And we know there's lots of work to be done, and the purse strings are always tight, so it's just trying to get more and more all the time. But keep up the good work and really enjoy the conversation today.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
So there you have it. Tune in next time to hear more interesting chats and discussion.
Myself and Deirdre will be back in 2 weeks' time, but do give us a review on Apple and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening to the Environment Edge podcast.